All right, so today we are in part one of our Foundations of Literacy Learning series. We are starting with phonological awareness to give an overview of some of those early reading and writing skills and the word solving that's so important to creating and supporting young, excited, engaged readers and writers. My name is Lisa Thomas. I'm the program manager for POPEY, and I am co-presenting today with my colleague, Jen Kelly. I'm based in Vancouver. Jen's up in the Shuswap region, and we will get started. So we're trying something new this year for our workshop resources, and we have created what's called a Padlet. So it's an online digital booklet of our resources. So this is a screenshot of it, and hopefully you were directed to it with our pre-workshop email. On the left there, you can see it's got links to our handouts. It had the Zoom information. And then it shares some of the resources and videos and other related resources that fit in with our content today of phonological awareness and some of those early and emergent literacy skills that we're supporting our students with in K-3. As always, you can also check out our website at popey.ca for additional printables and literacy resources to support students in K-3 classrooms. And our outcomes for today, what we'll be focusing on, and our goals for ourselves, facilitating this session for you. We will be defining phonological awareness, what it can look like in the classroom, and that includes the scope and sequence, and using mini lessons, activities, and routines to engage and support our students and help them make meaning in and out of the texts that we expose them to in the classroom, both in terms of what they're reading and what they're writing. And our series continues over the next 2 Wednesdays. Next week, we will focus in on phonemic awareness. And then on the 28th, we'll wrap up this series with a focus on phonics and an eye looking ahead to more advanced and developed reading comprehension and developing writing skills. So we like to do an opening reflection, a little bit of a warm up at the beginning, and also a way for you to reflect and connect on your own history as a learner. And so our question today is for you to reflect on your history as a word solver while reading and writing. So going back to those early days and your own experience in primary and intermediate, your elementary school years. For some of us, it's going a ways back, but what do you remember as being easy and what was difficult? And how do you think your history as a word solver, how does it impact you now in your role as an educator and supporting young readers and writers? So we are going to give you 1 minute. We'll play some music, a timer there for 1 minute. And just ask you to reflect privately on that. You can jot some notes about your own history, what was easy or difficult about learning some word solving skills in your days as an early reader and writer. And then when the music ends, what we'll ask you to do, just choose 1 or 2 things that you'd be comfortable sharing with the group. And please share that in the chat box. And then we'll get a little collection of everyone's musings and recollections on your experiences as word solvers. All right, thank you so much. So Kathy started us off there. Jen and Laura adding in their thoughts as well. If you're typing, that's wonderful, thank you. And have a look, please, if you don't have the chat box open, I encourage you to open it up and read through what other people are sharing. It's always interesting to find connections and commonality. I know from myself, I remember when I learned a rule or a grammar or spelling rule, I would use it and apply it to everything and generalize it, even when it didn't work. And then also being a voracious reader and reading and reading and reading. And of course, when you're reading it to yourself in your head, you don't always know that you're getting it right with the pronunciation. And then you read it out loud and someone sort of laughs or says, or my mom's saying, oh, no, that's not how we say that. She still teases us. My sister and I reading a book. It was sort of an early chapter book, grade 4 or 5 maybe. And there were 2 girls and they were named Genevieve and Penelope. And we were calling them Jeannie, Vivi, and Penelope. So that's kind of still a joke in our family about about the sounding it out and being good. And I remember teaching grade 4 and 5 when Harry Potter first came out. And I feel like almost every kid had that book on their desk and they'd read it during silent reading. And one of my sweetest girls said, you know, Miss Thomas, I can just really relate to this Hermie one character. I really feel like she's a kindred spirit. I just love Hermie one. And it took me a minute to figure out she meant Hermione, but the book was so new. Can you imagine a time when people didn't know that it was Hermione? So that's a little bit funny. So those are some things that I remember. I feel like I was lucky that it came easy to me. But again, once I found a rule, I hung on hard and fast to it. So those are regular things that we encounter. I know I had trouble because I always wanted it to just fit the rules. So yeah, Jen, anything there that's jumping out at you that you're seeing in the chat box or anything that you wanted to share?
A lot of people talking about the challenges, that some of us learned by rote memorization, and that was difficult, and being, marked on spelling. I remember I was always like a very good reader in spelling. I remember my second grade teacher marking, I wanted to challenge myself and write my last name, which was a tricky last name at the time. It wasn't Kelly, it was Klorak, and had a different kind of spelling. And I remember my teacher marking it wrong, even though we weren't supposed to put our last names on the test of whatever I was. I was devastated because I was, putting myself out there and challenging myself. So a lot of people talking about what kind of held them back a little bit.
Yeah, memorizing too. I see a lot of that. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing those. So the connection of the next step with that, and just to reflect maybe as the thread as we move through this hour, is how do you think your history and your own personal experience as a word solver might be informing or impacting some of your instructional and teaching decisions that you make around literacy and phonological awareness and some of this developmental foundational part of literacy? So just we invite you to reflect on that as we move through our content, and we will keep going. So this is from Word Matters, which is a fantastic resource from Fountas and Pinnell. And the way that they frame it is they're looking at 8 principles for literacy learning for what students need from us and what they need to understand. So at those early stages, it really is about oral language, and they're having that sense of language before they're having a sense of literacy. So the oral, the spoken, the sounds, and all of the things that are involved with that before we make that transfer and the connection from speech to print and texts, and looking at the bigger picture of story and sentences and words, and then within the words, looking at the letters, syllables, the blends, onset and rhyme, all of those nuts and bolts to help them read and write continuous text while they're developing their flexibility and their fluency and their comprehension skills really gradually over time. The analogy we like that we use sometimes is thinking back to how we learn to drive a car or swim or ride a bike, and for how complex and challenging and difficult those things are. It's a nice connection to make with literacy. None of this happens overnight. It doesn't even happen within one grade. They are learning how to read and write over 3, 4, 5 years and beyond. And so our year with them is moving the students along as much as we can, but it is very complex. And because of the complexity and the difficulty, that really reminds us that we need to be doing the repetition many, many, many times. So reinforcing, repeating lessons and learning and giving students lots of time to have that time to word solve and practice putting words together, taking words apart, and playing with language, playing with sound, playing with letters, playing with words as they begin to, as we immerse them in literacy experiences, both reading and writing and thinking and speaking. So this flexible word solving, this breaks it down into 9 areas that we can focus on and target through our literacy block, through the weeks and the months of our year. So starting up on the top right there in that blue zone with early literacy concepts. So even, that text, we can speak words and then we can get it down in writing, that there's a connection there. And then looking at phonological awareness, the letter knowledge, going the whole way around that circle there, getting more advanced, looking at word meaning, vocabulary, word structure. Ultimately, we're wanting to equip our students with transferable word solving skills, that they have a toolkit that they can use when they're approaching text that they're reading or writing, and that they know which tool to use at which time. So we really need them to be active participants in this and actively engaged in using all of their thought processes to draw on the tools and the skills that will help them in any given situation when they're working with text. So we hear a lot about decoding. We hear a lot about early and emergent literacy, supporting and creating good readers, but the writing piece is just as important. So we want to think about the decoding as well as the encoding, and this foundational word solving, spending the time here will enable them to have higher levels of success as readers and writers. So as Miriam Traherne says, our keynote from last year's POPEY conference, if you were lucky enough to attend that and listen to her share some of her work, we want them to be active word solvers so they can recognize words, take them apart, put them together, know what they mean, and then connect them to other words. So thinking of transferable skills that they can use as they interact with text.
Okay, so now we're going to back up a little bit before we go forward and talk about practical classroom applications. We're going to talk about our reading brain, specifically how we are wired for spoken language, but not for written language. So that is a lot about how we can make those connections for our students. So as humans, we have been speaking for over 50,000 years, but we have only been writing and reading words for 5,000 years. And when we look at that and think about the fact that we are not pre-wired for that written and reading language, we have to consider how we can build that system for our students so we're setting them up for success. If you're interested in looking more at the history of the written word, Marianne Wolf has a couple of really great books that I would definitely recommend. There's Proust and the Squid and Reader Come Home, Reading in the Digital Age, that are both fantastic books that give you a lot of history on how we evolved with our reading brains and our spoken language. So I'm going to talk briefly about what we need to do to build that new system in our brain because we don't have it pre-wired from birth. Okay, so what we need to do is build this new system for us to read. So what is a word? A word is pronunciation, meaning, and spelling. So we need to understand, we need to know how to say it, we need to know what it means, and we need to know how to spell it. Now, if we look a little bit more closely at the different parts of the brain that do those different things, we can also see that we can call pronunciation sound, meaning, and spelling what the word visually looks like. Now, all of those different parts are coming from different parts of our brain, and we need to help our students connect them. And how we're going to do that is through a fun analogy using alliteration. Now, this analogy comes from Carolyn Strom, and she explained it very well in a conference that I went to recently. So we're going to use some alliteration because we're going to have some fun with alliteration later on our workshop today. But basically, we're going to have meaning mountain, sound city, and visual village. Remember, we need to connect all of those areas. So visual village is really looking at, from birth, we're able to recognize objects and faces. That's what our visual village does from birth. Sound city processes sounds, and meaning mountain is where our memories are, or we can also call that background knowledge. Now, from birth, we have connections between sound city and meaning mountain, and meaning mountain and visual village, but there is no direct connection between visual village and sound city when we are born. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But let's first look at how there is a strong connection between meaning mountain and sound city through a short little video that I'm going to show you now. So this is an MIT researcher, Deb Roy, I believe his name. And he was really interested in how his infant son produced language. So he put video cameras all over the house and videotaped his son speaking and going from the concept of ga, which is meaning water, to the actual spoken word of water. So let's look at what this looks like, and then we'll talk about those connections that are made. So I love that because it really shows how that you can see the connections between meaning mountain and sound city being formed over time, and how that repetition and that patience and that just emphasis on, having a son try out different things and finally coming to the correct pronunciation of water is shown. Okay, so now when we're learning to read, let's look at that. So visual look at learning to read. When we're learning to read, we need visual village to recognize letters now, not just objects and faces. And we need sound city to blend sounds. And we need meaning mountain to make meaning still. So what we actually need to happen when we're learning to read is we need visual village to go through sound city and then finally to meaning mountain. So what that looks like is if in visual village, we see the word B-A-T. We're going to go put that into sound city and go B-at, and then go down to meaning mountain and say the word or understand the word bat. And then we're going to use either our background knowledge or our context to make meaning of that. Now, this is interesting because when we see the similarities between reading and writing, as we often do, we can see that as we are having our students write, they're actually starting with determining meaning. They decide what they're going to write before they do the other steps. So they determine the meaning, then they go to sound city and blend the sounds together, and then they create the words. So you can see that after determining meaning, they want to write the word bat, they go to sound city and go at, and then go to visual village and create the word bat. So when we're decoding and encoding, all roads go through sound city, so that you can strengthen those connections through both processes of reading and writing. Okay, now as we develop over time, we now have visual village recognizing words and meaning mountain making meaning, and we can skip sound city when we get to the point of automaticity. So if we already know the word is bat, we don't need to go through sound city and decode it. We don't need to go through sound city and encode it when writing. We can go directly between visual village and meaning mountain and skip those steps, and that's where we have that automaticity. Now, the tricky part is that visual village isn't as easy as we think, because when we're born, remember, we have that visual village is all about recognizing faces and objects. So we have something called near invariance. I think that's the right term, near invariance. And what that means is that we need to actually unlearn that, or we need to prompt our students or our children to unlearn that, because when they're recognizing faces and objects, they get to know that a chair is a chair, whether it's standing upright, whether it's on its side, whether it's upside down, still a chair. But now we're teaching letters, and they need to know that a B is not the same as a D, a P is not the same as a Q, an S is not the same as a 2. So they have to unlearn what they've already learned. And that's what makes it kind of tricky. Okay, so that brief little history of our reading brain. Now I'd like to take a moment for you to reflect on this. So knowing that, how can we create those opportunities to intentionally focus on building those connections between these parts of the brain? So I'm going to put a minute timer on here. And if you could pop that into the chat box, any ideas at all that you can come up with, it's wonderful for us to share different ways that we can do that in our classrooms. Excellent. So many of you talked about using different ways to make those connections visible for our students and explicit. So using visual images, sounds, and text together at the same time, making those connections for our students, using things like Itchy's alphabet, using games between auditory and visual cues, absolutely, rearranging, manipulating, providing different versions of letters and images, ABC puppets, excellent, singing and saying sounds while looking at letters, so making those connections, definitely using evidence-based scope and sequence. Okay, awesome. Keep writing in there if you have more to share. We're going to continue on, and Lisa's going to take over, but lots of great ideas that we can share with each other, and get a great list of things that we can be doing in our classroom.
Yeah,
Okay.
Thanks for sharing that, Jen. I found that just so interesting and such a good example of that. We know a chair turned on its side or upside down is still a chair, but that can't and shouldn't work. We need to know and understand more about letters, that they go a certain way, and how the alphabet and language, the parts of it that matter, and those hard and fast rules. So I really liked that. So building on the early learning, what we want to remember and keep coming back to is helping our students gain an understanding of and drawing their attention to the nuances of oral language. So in these early stages, so much of that is about helping them understand. So we're explicitly highlighting and pointing out those distinctions and the boundaries between words, letter clusters, and individual letters, and talking about how we can use those all to help us create messages and create meaning in what we're writing and in what we're reading. And so looking at why we started with phonological awareness to kick off the series is because it is a sort of an umbrella term that conveys and contains the general awareness of words, rhyming words, onsets, rhymes, syllables, and individual sounds. So the phonemes, which is what we'll focus on next week. Phonemic awareness really is that focus on spoken words and individual sounds. And then phonics is more about the bigger impact of the letter sound relationships that we see in the reading and writing that we have our students engage in. And when we look at the emergence or the scope and sequence of phonological awareness, obviously that it's a scope and sequence for us teaching it because it is the emergence of how these skills develop most naturally in our students. And obviously it builds from the biggest, most open, simple concepts to get more complicated, more focused in, and paying attention to those nuances of language, like we say, going from sentences to words to syllables and blends, onset and rhymes. So you see here, starting with rhyming is the great spot to start, moving through to alliteration, segmenting sentences, syllables, onset and rhyme. And then on the right here, all of these different ways that we can play with phoneme. So matching, isolating, segmenting, and blending, manipulating, substituting, replacing, all of those things. So what we want to remember is, if you think back to my analogy earlier of learning to drive a car, ride a bike, or how to swim, we didn't learn that overnight. And so our students, this is so complex, they need a great deal of repetition, explicit instruction, and a ton of time and practice daily and weekly with that minds-on and hands-on, all of those opportunities and play with language to be able to practice and master these gradually over time. And so when we look at word work or word study, if we can always remember that we are laying the groundwork for future reading and writing. And so the content of what we're doing in our word work, if we have them doing play centers, literacy centers, activities, manipulatives, wiki sticks or magnetic letters or whiteboards, all of those wonderful things that we can use to get them engaged hands-on in playing with language, what we're doing there in word work needs to align with the work that we're having them do and what we're engaging them and drawing their attention to as they're reading and they're writing. So when we're introducing high frequency words, it's what are they just starting to need and use in their reading and writing? And they align and they move forward together, and you build and grow that through the year. So your word work informs your reading and writing instruction and mini lessons and the practice and the activities your students are doing. And then all of that teaching with your reading and writing informs back to what you're exposing them to and drawing their attention to in the word work that's isolated, that's happening outside of texts. So we want to think about it as a two-pronged approach. And so we need to make sure that our instruction is explicit in both of these tracks to help our students make meaning and make those connections in the neural pathways in their brains. So if they have the context and the connection, it helps to cement their understanding and solidify it in really important ways. So we're making meaning out of text. So all of those things on the left that we typically think of as word work. So you can see phonological awareness, letter knowledge, letter sound relationships, gradually moving towards more complex word meaning, vocabulary, word structure, to get them with that bundle and a little toolkit of word solving actions. Also, what we're doing is we're drawing their attention to it and talking about it in all of these scaffolded reading and writing experiences that we are engaging them in. So the active read aloud, mini lessons, shared and guided reading, and the independent reading they're able to do. Same thing again with the writing. So modeled writing, mini lessons, shared and guided, and their independent writing. So we want to be calling it out intentionally and drawing their attention to it repeatedly over time to help solidify that knowledge and understanding for them, and to continue to support them as their skills build and their abilities as readers and writers become more sophisticated, and just keep raising the bar for them to continue strengthening their skills with a wider set and a stronger set that, like Jen talked about, it's more automatic, it's more fluent, it's something that they can do without having the heavy labor of really having to think a lot about it. Becoming automatic means they can do it more effortlessly. And so reading and writing becomes more easy for them over time. And as always, all of this is being facilitated and supported by the oral language that's happening and the discussions and the thinking and the talking that we're having our students do. So we're going to do a little rhyming activity here as an example of making meaning out of text. If we were all together in the class, I'd have you on the carpet and I'd have maybe this on the chart paper or on the whiteboard. And I would I would read this out. Maybe it's something that I know by heart, a really common or familiar rhyme. I'll read this to you now. I'm just having the graphics here. It's a little bit of an abridged, modified version of it just because we're virtual. So 3 little kittens have lost their mittens, and then they began to cry. Oh, mother dear, we sadly fear we've lost our mittens by. What? Lost your mittens, you naughty kittens? Then you shall have no pie. Meow, 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 my. I wonder how long that one's been around for. I think a long time. So now we talk about what words did you notice rhyming there? So you can enter that into the chat box if you want. There are a couple of rhyming pairs there. There's a real obvious one. So share that in the chat box if you don't mind. Kind of putting you in the role of the students here. Thank you, Julie. Yes, so we've got kittens and mittens and cry and buy and pie and my. Fear and dear. Yes, wonderful. So we can be drawing attention to the rhyming and that it sounds similar. They've got similar endings. We could point out too that pie sounds like my, but they're spelled differently. But if we're just focusing on the rhyme and the sounds, we don't really need to go there because that's not what the focus is about. And my invitation to you right now, can you substitute another animal and its belongings for kittens and mittens? So if we were going to write a new verse of this poem together and make one up, what else could you think of? So pick another animal and something that rhymes with that animal. So some examples here. Oh, wonderful. We've got cats and hats, dogs and clogs. That is a funny picture that conjures up. Ducks and trucks. Choose your own animal. You're doing that. I'm going to put flies and ties. Very nice. So I don't think we need a timer here. I think we've got the gist of it. I think we're having some fun with this. I think our students would have some fun with this, even illustrating it. If we did some writing and the students did some illustrations, we could make a little book of some poems about different animals, goats and boats. Thanks, Jen. If anybody's got a trickier multisyllabic animal that they can find a rhyming word for, feel free to throw it in there. So here's an example of us talking about it. It's not grounded or tied to a text that the students are reading, and it's not necessarily tied to writing. It's just an oral activity that we're doing together with teacher support and modeling and some examples given so the students know kind of what it should look like. So now what that can look like in text, we've got this lovely Down by the Bay by our beloved Raffi, world treasure and BC resident. So I know I used to listen to this Fridays in grade 2. We would have music played over the speakers to all our classrooms in primary, and we would stand up and get to sing. And I still remember singing Down by the Bay. I do think that was a formative part of my early engagement with reading, even though I wasn't a great singer, we all sang. So I think we all know the Down by the Bay. If we had more time and we were together, I would read this all to you. But we know that it's down by the bay where the watermelons grow. And here we've got just a few things. So did you ever see a goose kissing a moose? Did you ever see a whale with a polka dot tail? Did you ever see a fly wearing a tie? Someone said that in the last one. Good connection there. Did you ever see a bear combing his hair? And did you ever see llamas eating their pajamas? So it's delightful. The images are very silly, very silly. The kids just love this kind of stuff. And then again, so here's the bear combing his hair. It's quite cute. So now we've got that as our mentor text and our example. I'll do the same thing here, but I will use the timer because I think we can go a bit further with this one. So the obvious, most simple leap to transferring to students having a go on their own is to pick other animals. You can see I'm building up in trickiness. There's dragon is a little bit harder, but I'll give you 1 minute, see if we can have everybody here. We've got just about 50 people. So let's see if we can have 50 new entries, new pages we can add to our Down by the Bay book. So one thing it makes me think of, this was one of my favorite things to do in my class, was to have a mentor text and read it out. And then we would build on it or make our own as inspired by. But think about the students choosing a phrase and whether they write it or we type it up and print it out for them on a piece of paper, and then they get to illustrate their rhyme. And we turn that into a class book. And then that becomes one of the texts in the class library that students can take out and read during independent or buddy reading. I would just love to see some of these. I would love to see the fairy with the toes that are kind of hairy. So we could really have some fun and silliness with this too. And I think the students, if they're coming up with these ideas, they're going to be really engaged. Again, making a book takes it to another level. We're making the connection between the word solving, the reading, the oral piece, and the writing. So really powerful. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm just thrilled to see all of those. Maybe Jen and I will make our own book out of these. We just need an illustrator. All right. So as we've talked about, explicit instruction of these phonological skills, these early word solving skills is so critical. They don't learn it by accident. They don't learn it just by brushing up to it or hearing it a couple of times. It needs to be so systematic, so explicit and sequential, following what we know, that order, the emergence of the skills. We need to move through supporting those skills through the school year. And so the mini lesson, the power of it, it's mini, not maxi, so less than 7 or 8 minutes. It's strategy focused, one strategy at a time. We need to model, do direct and explicit instruction, and then give them the opportunity for guided practice in a safe and supportive setting. So safe and supportive, they need to know it's safe to take risks and to try and make mistakes. They're not going to get embarrassed or shamed. It's safe. We want them to feel comfortable taking risks and trying things. And really, we want to model and set up that we're all learning about language by playing with it. And so this will help them transfer learning each and every one of these strategies and skills to their own toolkit, and they'll be able to use it with independence. But again, this is going to take many, many repetitions, but this is the framework that we can use in a mini lesson. So the modeling is super important, direct and explicit, talking about the how and the why. The why is really helpful for students to know, understand that this will help them become good readers and writers, but they need guided practice. They need the time to try it out if we expect them ever to be independent with it. So the structure flows from I do, we do it together, and then you'll be able to do this on your own. So that's scaffolded support and the gradual release of responsibility. So Jen's going to guide us through a demo of modeling a mini lesson on alliteration, as she mentioned earlier.
So speaking of playing with language, as Lisa mentioned, we're going to do some playing with alliteration, and this will really model that, model the mini lesson that Lisa was just speaking about, where we go from direct modeling, direct instruction to some guided practice, and then down to independent practice. So if I was with all of you in my classroom and I would be looking at this, I would be in front of a chart paper and you would be all around me, and I would say, listen closely to this sentence and tell me what you notice about it. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. So what do you notice about this sentence? And of course, my students would say, wow, there's lots of sounds in it, and it's a little bit silly, all of those different things that my students would notice about it. And then I would explicitly say, let's really focus on that sound. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. And then write it out, say it again. And now let's underline all of the initial p sounds so that we can really focus on that. And that's called alliteration. We like to play with language and have similar sounds at the beginning of our words to play with it and come up with new and interesting ways to express ourselves. So once we have it written out and our students have practiced it a little bit, we've talked about it, we've noticed all of the sounds in it, we might even have, what is pickled peppers conversation, then I would invite them to think of a sentence, even if it's 2 words, maybe using their own name that both words start with the same letter. So perhaps we started with Jennifer jumps, Lisa laughs, and maybe from there we expanded a little bit, depending on our students' ability and interest. We could even expand that a little bit farther to Jennifer jumps over junipers, Lisa laughs at lions. So we can really, and then underline it, write it out, practice it, so that they can see that guided practice part of working with language and playing with language in a safe, supportive setting, as Lisa mentioned there. So I'm going to challenge you now to practice out some guided practice on your own and see if you can come up with a alliteration sentence for one of the sentence starters below. Jumping
And if you
Jane, Lincoln
want
Love.
to, yeah,
Oh, yeah,
if you want to use your name too, that would be great. That's
absolutely.
kind of a nice way to tie it back to make it meaningful for each of us, like we would with our students. Like Jen's first
Definitely.
example used her name. Yeah.
Wow, you guys are so good at playing with language. This is wonderful. Thank you for engaging in that and using your name to really bring out the meaning in it. Hopefully, you have a chance to share these wonderful alliteration sentences with your students. So you can see that now you could then have them, we've done some guided practice, we've done these together, we've shared them, and now we can see if our students can transfer to some independent work as well. You'll probably notice that a lot of, depending on their ability level, you might have a lot of alliteration sentences in their writing from now on, or some attempts at that with the oral language as well. We can have some fun with that.
Yeah, it's making me think too of them being called tongue twisters and kind of how it is, we sort of trip over what we're saying. Again, I'm thinking back to illustrating. These would be great to do illustrations of if students wanted to do one pagers or again to put it into a book.
Absolutely. Yes. Thanks, Lisa. Okay, and we have this wonderful graphic by Lane, who nicely explains the dual track of spoken language and written language and how they build together at the same time to really build students' awareness of both spoken language and written language and that they're connected. Because sometimes our students don't understand necessarily that spoken language and written language are connected, and they think there are two separate things that they need to learn. So the more that we connect them, as we were talking about earlier, with the reading brain and all the different things that we were talking about there, but really looking at the awareness of our spoken language and pointing that out for our students and directly and explicitly connecting it to concepts of print, to letter recognition, and then blending them into how we understand phonemes, phonograms, and finally, how we understand and develop our word and reading skills. So just a wonderful way to really notice that and explicitly share that with not this graphic, but share that information with our students so they understand the why and the how they are building their language together. And here's another graphic that you probably recognize, Scarborough's reading rope. And this really points out how we use that language comprehension and word recognition to generally build that knowledge together. And it builds to that skilled reading and writing and skilled reading that we can then have our students work with in a way that they are automatic, that they are fluent. So if you think back to what we've been talking about, increasing strategic activity through the language comprehension and also increasing automaticity through the word recognition and blending those together in ways that's going to make that rope tight, strategic, strong, so that our students are empowered to have those strategic abilities to uncover words that are unknown and also work within a fluent system. And I just love this quote by Hollis Scarborough. Being strong on the lower strands affords more opportunities to acquire knowledge of the upper strands, and being strong on the upper strands has been shown to enable faster and more accurate decoding of unfamiliar words. Therefore, if any of the strands get frayed, it can hold back development of the other strands, and by extension can eventually weaken the entire rope. So the thing that really stood out for me with this quote is if any of the strands get frayed. And it's just the most beautiful word to represent the reading rope, right? Because you can actually see that and how it is. So we need to provide those opportunities for our students to make sure that those ends don't get frayed and that we approach it in a systematic, explicit, coordinated effort so that that rope continues to be strong and develop its strength.
Mm-hmm.
So one way that we can play with language a little bit more is and look at manipulating. We've played around with rhyming, we've played around with alliteration. Now let's play around with manipulating words based on sounds and what we can take out, put back in, have students play with. What does it change? What does it, so they can kind of see and hear how they can be in charge of manipulating words, and it gives them ownership then to take some risks with their own writing, reading, beginning emergent skills. So just a short video. This is one of our POPEY videos found on our YouTube, and we're just going to quickly show you what this can look like in practice.
Just zip ahead a little bit.
Letters. Let's start with the word bed. We spell that B-E-D. B-E-D spells bed. Next, I'm going to keep the letter B and keep the letter E and change the last letter to a T. B-E-T spells bet. I'm going to keep the letter B for the next word and keep the letter T, but change the middle letter to the letter A, makes the A sound. B-A-T spells bat.
I'm just going to zip ahead towards the end. So you are completed. There we go.
To finish off our word ladders with. And that's how we can change just one letter at a time to make a bunch of new words using a word ladder.
Perfect. Thanks, Lisa. So you can see how easily that we can work with our students in this way and have them play and notice and wonder and explore with word ladders. So we've been talking a lot about the importance of foundational skills, and we want to show you why they're so important. Like we've been talking about, maybe things that seem kind of automatic or things that, we think students pick up anyways, but really the explicit instruction to make sure that these are solid foundational skills are so important, because phonemic awareness, which may be important if it's on its way to phonics, which may be important if it's on its way to fluency, if it's on its way to vocabulary, if it's on its way to comprehension, if it's on its way to critical reasoning and problem solving, and if it's finally on its way to action in the world, changing something that matters. So yes, phonemic awareness is one tiny little part of what we do with our students. Phonics is one tiny little part of what we do with our students, but all of those things put together is what makes reading and writing meaningful, because that gives our students a voice in the world. That gives our students the ability to reason with other people through written language, which, as we mentioned, is fairly new in the human brain. So we want to make sure that we are giving our students the best opportunities and the best ability to go out into the world, take action, and use their voice. Okay, so coming up next in the next couple of weeks, this is super exciting. So next week, we're going to really be focusing on that phonemic awareness, where we're focusing on sounds. And then the following week, we're going to bring it back to phonics, where we're focusing on the letters and their sounds and how they work together. So we really hoped that this foundational literacy skills was building on the phonological awareness, but then how is that connected to phonemic awareness, and how is that connected to phonics, and how do we put them all together? So hopefully you will be excited about joining us for the next couple. And I just want to point out again that we are working at a very emergent level with our students, but they are readers and writers at this level. So we need to honor and really extend their opportunities to be readers and writers, and to call them readers and writers. So even if they know that print tells a story, they are a reader. If they know that They're reading from memories and patterns and pictures. They are a reader. Writers, if they're using scribbles and symbols, they are a writer. If they are writing what they're telling what their writing says, but it's different each time, they are still a writer. So we honor that and we encourage where they are as readers and writers in this emergent state.
Mm-hmm. So important. Thank you.
Over to you, Lisa.
Yeah. Well, that was a fast, that hour just flew by. So just in wrapping up, we'd like to just collect here what the research and the resources that we've shared with you today. There we go on the left. So this is everything that we covered and included. So some of the research on everything emergent early literacy, reading and writing, phonological awareness. And here's some of the activities that we guided you through. And our question to you, if you want to, I don't think I'll use a timer here, but I will put this question to you. What is one thing that you can commit to try in your classroom or your role, say in the coming week? If you can share that in the chat box, it's always so helpful for Jen and I to see what activities or lessons or strategies, routines resonated with people that they really connected to. That helps us make sure we can continue to create, refine our workshops so that they do include things that really resonate for people. So thank you if you can share with us. What's the one thing that jumped out at you? And just share with you our sources page, the books, presentations, the info links, and the videos that we've shared with you today. If you are interested in doing some more research on your own or checking anything out, here's our contact info. If you do want to get in touch, if you have any questions or you're looking for resources or supports, please get in touch. Hopefully we will see you back here next Wednesday for phonemic awareness and the 28th for our session on phonics to wrap up this series. And we are just past 4:15, so if you've got to go, no worries. But if you're sticking around and you've got a couple minutes, we've got a really cute closing video with a focus on kindness. So as we move through September, don't forget to be kind to yourself.